The porch light flickered above me as I stood there freezing, watching their silhouettes move around the table inside. Still, I kept my breath steady in the cold, letting that flicker paint the truth across the glass. As the light buzzed louder, it matched the sting running through my chest. While its same unsteady glow brushed my face, I realized it had seen more loyalty from me than they ever had. The same flicker reminded me, some doors stay shut because people like them prefer you outside. That's when I knew my justice would begin quietly, right where they thought I'd stay forever. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Helen's hand trembled as she gripped the doorknob of Daniel's house, her fingers stiff from the cold. It was a frigid November afternoon, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made every breath feel sharp. She had arrived early, eager to help with the dinner preparations, to add her touch to the meal, to be a part of the family she had nurtured for decades. The house looked the same as it always did, warm, inviting, the scent of freshly baked pies and roasting turkey wafting through the air as she stood on the doorstep. Helen stood still for a moment, taking in the familiar sounds of a home full of life. She tried to summon the excitement she had felt for Thanksgivings past, the memories of crowded kitchens and laughter filling the spaces, but it was hard to feel anything but the chill creeping in from the outside. She knocked, her heart racing. The door opened, but not with the warmth she had hoped for. Tina's face appeared, her lips tight, her eyes sharp with an edge that Helen couldn't quite place. "Oh, you're here," Tina said flatly, her tone void of any cheer. Helen forced a smile, stepping forward to embrace her daughter-in-law. But Tina stepped back quickly, blocking the door. "There's no room at the table," Tina said, her voice cold as the November air. Helen's smile faltered, but she held her ground, surprised by the lack of even a hint of warmth. "Oh, I see," she said, trying to read Tina's face for some sign of irony. But there was none. "I could have helped in the kitchen." Tina's gaze flickered briefly to her own reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting a stray strand of hair. "The kids are already settled, and there's not enough room," she said, looking down at her phone as if she were checking messages. Helen felt the words like a slap in the face. She could feel her chest tighten, the weight of all the years she had spent putting others first, always willing to make space, to give in. And now, nothing. Nothing at all. She looked over at Daniel, who stood just inside the doorway, his eyes avoiding hers. He shifted uncomfortably, his hand rubbing the back of his neck, but he said nothing. Not a word. The silence between them grew thick and suffocating. I'll just wait outside then," Helen said, her voice tight, betraying the hurt she felt. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want to beg for a seat at the table, but the sting of being dismissed, of being pushed aside without a second thought, burned deep inside her chest. Tina didn't even look up as she stepped aside, gesturing to the cold, unwelcoming outside. "Yeah, that's fine. It's too cold for you to be inside anyway." Helen stepped back, her heart sinking, and before she could turn, she heard Tina's sharp voice again. "Dinner won't be long. I'll bring you something out if you're cold," Tina said, the suggestion ringing with insincerity. Without waiting for a response, Tina shut the door behind her, leaving Helen standing on the stoop, alone. The wind bit at her face, and the sounds of her family, the clink of silverware, the laughter, the chatter, carried through the walls and windows. Helen stood there, frozen to the spot, as she tried to steady her breath. The shock of it all kept her rooted in place. How had she come to this? How had she become an outsider in her own family? The weight of the isolation pressed on her chest, each breath feeling harder than the last. She could almost taste the bitterness in the air, cold and biting, just like the rejection she felt from those inside. She stood there a while, watching the window, the soft glow from inside casting long shadows across the lawn. She saw Jake, her grandson, peering through the glass, his small face frowning as he caught sight of her standing in the cold. He tapped on the window, his expression uncertain, but Tina was quick to intervene. Helen could see her moving toward the window, blocking his view, her finger raised in warning. "Don't worry about her," Tina said, loud enough for Helen to hear through the glass. "It's too cold for Grandma to come in." Helen turned her face away, blinking back tears that threatened to spill. She didn't need their pity. She didn't need Jake's sympathy, or Tina's false concern. The family she had once believed in, the family she had given everything for, had turned their back on her. And now, as the minutes ticked by, all she could do was stand there, watching them feast while she froze in the cold. Her heart ached, but she knew this wasn't the end. This wasn't the way she was going to be remembered. No, she wasn't going to let them break her. Not this time. But for now, all she could do was watch and wait. Helen's hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, the sharp click of the lock reverberating in the silence of her front porch. The door swung open with a slight creak, and she stepped inside, her body heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. The warmth of her house hit her like a wave, but it did little to thaw the chill that had settled deep within her bones. She didn't bother to remove her coat. Instead, she walked straight into the living room, dropping her purse on the couch. The house felt emptier than it had in years. It was quiet now, too quiet. The house she once shared with her late husband, a home filled with laughter, the sound of children's voices, and the hum of family life, now felt like a hollow shell. Her chest tightened as she tried to shake off the feeling of alienation that had crept in since she stepped onto the stoop of Daniel's house earlier that afternoon. Helen sank into her favorite chair by the window, staring at the dimming daylight outside. The air inside the room felt stale, as if even the walls could feel the weight of her solitude. She hadn't expected this. The cold indifference, the isolation. She had prepared herself for a simple Thanksgiving dinner, perhaps a little awkward but still familiar, still family. What had happened today, though, was something far worse. It wasn't just being pushed aside. It was the silence. The absolute crushing silence from Daniel. The silence that came from being nothing more than a ghost in the lives of those she loved. The events of the afternoon replayed in her mind over and over again like a broken record. Tina's cold dismissal, the way Daniel didn't even try to defend her, the way they had all just gone inside without a word, leaving her standing in the cold. She had never felt so invisible, so disposable. She reached up to touch her face, brushing away a tear she hadn't even realized had fallen. The phone rang, cutting through the silence. Helen wiped her eyes quickly and answered, not checking the caller ID. "Hello?" Her voice came out shakier than she intended. "Helen? It's Sally," came the warm, familiar voice on the other end. "How are you, dear?" Sally's voice was a balm to her raw nerves. She let out a slow breath, grateful for the comforting presence of her best friend, even if it was only through the phone. "I don't know, Sally, I'm confused. Hurt," she admitted, her voice thick. "I thought I'd be with my family today, but they shut me out." Sally paused, and Helen could hear the sympathy in her voice when she spoke again. "You're not the first person to feel this way, you know. Family can be cruel sometimes, but that doesn't mean you deserve it." Helen leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixated on the soft flicker of the candle she had lit earlier. It felt like the only warmth left in the room. "I don't understand, Sal. After everything I've done for them, I've given so much. How could they just throw me out like that?" Sally sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that came from experience. "You've been quiet for so long, Helen. Too quiet. You've let them walk all over you for years, haven't you?" Helen's chest tightened. She was right. The years of biting her tongue, of keeping the peace at any cost, had built up until it became second nature. But the silence, the compliance, it had only ever worked in their favor, not hers. "You've got to stop letting them treat you like this," Sally continued, her voice firm but gentle. "Don't let this go. Don't let them continue to walk all over you. You've got more power than you think, Helen. You don't have to be the victim anymore." The words echoed in Helen's mind. She had been a victim for so long, passively accepting the role she had been given, the role they had assigned her. But now, something inside her shifted. Something snapped. "What should I do?" Helen whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. She hadn't asked for advice in so long. "Do what you've always been afraid to do," Sally urged. "Take control. You've spent your life bending for them. Now it's time to stand up for yourself. It's your life, Helen. You don't need their approval to be who you are or to live how you want to." Helen sat up straighter, her heart pounding. She could feel it now, this new determination, pushing against the walls of her chest. She was done. Done with the years of being quiet. Done with letting others define her place in their world. She wasn't going to be their punching bag anymore. "You're right," she said, the words feeling both foreign and liberating in her mouth. "I'm done. No more silence." Sally's voice softened. "I'm proud of you, Helen. I know it's hard, but you can do this." A small smile tugged at Helen's lips as she looked out the window, her mind already spinning with possibilities. No longer would she stand outside in the cold, watching them live their lives without her. No longer would she let Tina's cruelty or Daniel's inaction define her. She had power. She had the right to choose her future, her legacy. And it was time she started acting like it. She glanced at the clock, then slowly reached for the phone. The lawyer's number was already in her contacts. Janet Turner, her trusted advisor, her legal guide. It was time to take the first step. No more silence. As she dialed the number, her heart raced. She didn't know where this path would lead, but she knew one thing for sure. She would no longer wait for permission to live her life. And with that, the silence began to shatter. The conference room was sterile and clinical, filled with the quiet hum of air conditioning and the soft clink of a pen tapping against the desk. Janet Turner, the family lawyer, sat across from Helen, her sharp eyes glancing over the documents in front of her. The smell of fresh coffee lingered faintly in the air, but it couldn't mask the tension between them. The same tension that had built up inside Helen's chest over the past few days. The feeling of something long suppressed finally breaking free. Helen sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the sleek, dark wood of the table, unable to meet Janet's gaze. She hadn't even fully understood why she'd come to the office today, but now that she was here, she felt a strange kind of clarity settling over her. For so many years, she had been trapped in a family dynamic where her needs, her feelings, had been invisible, overshadowed by the demands of others. But now it was time for her to be seen. Time for her to reclaim control. Janet broke the silence, her voice calm but steady. "Helen, I know this isn't easy, but you've made the right decision coming here. It's important to consider your options carefully." Helen nodded, but the words felt heavy in her mouth. She had been replaying everything that had happened, the coldness of Tina, the silence of Daniel, and it had all led her to this moment. She had built her life around the idea of family, but now, she could see it clearly. They hadn't built their lives around her, not in the way she deserved. "I want to make sure this never happens again," Helen said quietly, her fingers curling into fists in her lap. "I want to ensure that my legacy, my estate, doesn't go to people who don't appreciate me." Janet leaned forward, her brow furrowing slightly. "You're talking about your will then? The trust?" "Yes." Helen replied, her voice firm now. I want to make changes. I want to make sure my money, my property, goes to people who will value me, who will see me for who I am. There it was, the heart of it. The simple truth she had been afraid to admit. She had the power to choose who would be in her life, even after she was gone. She didn't have to keep giving and giving to a family that had, time and time again, pushed her aside. Janet nodded thoughtfully, pulling a legal pad from the folder in front of her. We can certainly adjust your will. We can set up a trust that excludes Daniel and Tina. You can specify exactly who gets what and who doesn't. Helen's pulse quickened. The words sounded so simple, but the weight of them felt enormous. She had spent so much of her life trying to be the person everyone else needed her to be. Now, she was finally going to be the person she needed to be. A person who demanded respect. A person who wouldn't stand in the cold anymore. I want to make sure Jake is taken care of, Helen said, her voice softening slightly. But not in the way Tina would want. I don't want her or Daniel to control his future. He deserves more. Janet scribbled a note, glancing up at Helen. We can set up a separate trust for Jake. You can name a guardian, someone who you trust to protect his interests. But we'll need to make sure the language is airtight, especially if you're excluding his parents from the inheritance. Helen looked out the window, her mind racing. Excluding his parents. The words tasted strange on her tongue, but there was no hesitation in her heart. Jake was the only one who still mattered. And if he was to inherit anything, it would be from her. Not from a family that had shown her nothing but disrespect. She could almost see it. Jake, a teenager now, maybe even an adult, standing at the same window, making decisions for himself. And Tina and Daniel? They wouldn't be there to influence him. They wouldn't be there to drag him down. I also want to donate the family heirlooms, Helen said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. I don't want them to be sold or wasted. I want them to go to people who'll truly appreciate them, perhaps a local charity, somewhere they can be preserved, cherished. Janet nodded approvingly. We'll add that to the plan, and we'll be sure the clauses are clear, especially with the no contest provision. If anyone tries to challenge your will, they'll forfeit everything. Helen felt a strange sense of empowerment wash over her. She had been afraid of making these decisions, afraid of the consequences. But now, as she sat across from Janet, she felt the weight lifting off her shoulders. She was no longer beholden to the whims of her son or his wife. She was the architect of her own fate. I'm ready, Helen said, her voice firm now. I want to move forward with the changes. I don't care what Daniel or Tina think. This is my life. Janet smiled, a quiet approval in her eyes. We'll get everything drafted and finalized. It'll be done properly, Helen. You have my word. Helen sat back, feeling the first glimmer of relief she had in days. She had made the decision. She had taken the first step toward creating a life and a legacy that would truly be hers. But as she looked at the papers in front of her, she knew that this was only the beginning. The hardest part was still ahead, confronting the people who had made her feel small and showing them that she was no longer willing to be silenced. As Janet stood to gather the documents, Helen's mind raced. She had taken control of her future, but the battle with her family was far from over. She wasn't just going to change her will, she was going to change everything. The phone rang as Helen sipped her tea, her eyes cast downward as the steam curled up from the mug. It had been 2 weeks since the meeting with Janet, 2 weeks since she had decided to take control of her life. The legal documents were nearly finalized, her will rewritten, the trust established, the family heirlooms earmarked for charity. It all felt surreal, but also strangely liberating. She had not yet shared her decision with Daniel, had not yet confronted him about what had happened on Thanksgiving. But she knew that moment would come. For now, She was content in her quiet rebellion. The phone rang again. The display read, Daniel. Helen stared at it for a moment, her finger hovering over the screen. She didn't want to pick up. She didn't want to open that door. Not yet. But the need for closure, the small, stubborn hope that maybe this time things would be different, had her answering. Hello? Her voice was steady, but her heart was a little heavier than she cared to admit. Mom, it's Daniel, came his voice, hesitant. I've been thinking about everything and, well, I was hoping you'd come over for Christmas dinner. Tina and we've talked, and we realize we should have treated you better. It's been tough, but we want to make things right. Helen's hand tightened around the mug, the warmth of the tea now a stark contrast to the coldness she felt spreading through her chest. She listened to Daniel's words, the same tone he had used before, apologetic but distant, as if he expected everything to just fall back into place, as if a single dinner could fix everything. I'm glad you're thinking about it, she said softly, carefully choosing her words, but I've already made other plans for Christmas. There was a pause on the other end, a silence that stretched too long. Helen could almost hear Daniel's disappointment, the tension that always came with him when he realized things weren't going his way. She waited for him to speak, but when he did, there was something else. Something more fragile, more reluctant. Oh, Daniel finally said. I see. Well, maybe next year. We'll have a proper gathering, you know? I just want you to know we miss you, Mom. Helen felt the familiar pang of guilt. She had heard this before. The empty promises, the hollow gestures of reconciliation. She had lived for years hoping things would change, hoping that the next apology would be sincere. But after everything, after Thanksgiving, after the years of being invisible in her own family, she couldn't go back. Not now. I appreciate the offer, Daniel, she said, her voice calm but resolute. But I'm good. I've got plans with friends. I'm not looking back. She hung up before he could respond, the finality of her decision ringing in her ears. She didn't need to explain herself further. She didn't need to make him understand. Helen set the phone down slowly, taking another sip of her tea. The weight in her chest wasn't quite gone, but it was different now. It wasn't the heaviness of guilt. It was the quiet strength of someone who had stopped begging for scraps of affection, someone who had learned that peace could be found in solitude, away from the chaos of a family that never truly saw her. Moments later, a text notification pinged on her phone. It was from Tina. Nice to know you've decided to leave us out of your life, Helen, but don't expect any sympathy when you realize what you've lost. Merry Christmas. Helen stared at the message for a moment, the familiar sting of Tina's passive aggression cutting through her resolve. Her fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to respond, to defend herself, to explain that this wasn't about them. But she didn't. She had no need to engage with this any longer. She deleted the message without a second thought, feeling lighter with every tap of the screen. She didn't need their validation. She didn't need to convince them she was right. She was done fighting for a place at the table, for a spot in a family that had already made their feelings clear. She wasn't going to let them drag her back into the toxic dance they'd always performed. She wasn't going to beg for a seat she'd long since earned, but had never been allowed to claim. Helen stood, placing the mug down carefully on the kitchen counter. A sense of quiet victory settled over her as she moved through the house, gathering a few things. Sally had invited her to join her and a few friends for Christmas. Something low-key, with no expectations or drama, just companionship and warmth. Helen dressed in something comfortable, something that made her feel at home in her own skin. She had nothing to prove, not to Daniel, not to Tina, not to anyone. As she stepped out the door, the cold hit her, but it didn't matter. For the first time in ages, the chill of the air felt refreshing, invigorating. She wasn't walking out of a house that had rejected her. She was stepping into her own future. By the time Helen arrived at Sally's house, the scent of freshly baked cookies and the sound of gentle laughter greeted her. Her heart lightened with every step, as she was welcomed into the warmth of people who truly cared. As the night wore on, with the glow of Christmas lights twinkling softly outside, Helen realized something important. She had been afraid of losing her family for so long, afraid that without them, she would be nothing. But now, in this moment, she understood the truth. She wasn't defined by the people who had cast her aside. She was defined by the people who saw her, who loved her for who she truly was. And as she raised her glass to toast with Sally and the others, she smiled. This was peace, and it was hers. No longer bound by the chains of family drama, Helen had finally found freedom in the love she had chosen. The wind had picked up, howling outside Helen's window, but she hardly noticed. The storm outside was nothing compared to the quiet, steady storm inside her heart. She sat at the kitchen table, the papers in front of her weighty with finality, her pen poised above the last section of her revised estate plan. Janet had sent over the final draft earlier that morning, and now Helen was ready to make it real. The decision had been made. Daniel and Tina would be excluded from her inheritance. The family she had fought so hard for, the family that had turned its back on her, would no longer have claim to her legacy. She could almost hear the ghost of her late husband, Robert, whispering to her. He had been the first to understand that their son and his wife would never truly appreciate her, that her sacrifices would go unnoticed, her presence taken for granted. Robert had always been there for her, but now he was gone, leaving her to navigate this path alone. She could almost see his smile, his eyes warm with approval as she made this choice. Helen took a deep breath, her gaze scanning the document one last time. The money, the property, the heirlooms, everything she had worked her whole life for, would now go to those who deserved it. Those who had been by her side when things got tough. Those who had never looked at her with judgment or disdain. She had spent far too long living in the shadows of others' expectations. It was time to step into the light. Her hand trembled slightly as she signed her name on the dotted line, the ink spreading across the page in a firm, resolute stroke. She wasn't just signing away assets. She was signing away the last vestiges of her old life, the life where she had bent over backward for people who never saw her for who she truly was. The weight on her shoulders, the burden of being good enough for Daniel and Tina, finally lifted. She was no longer beholden to them, no longer shackled to the idea of family as something she had to beg for. The family she had chosen, the friends who had stood by her, were her true legacy now. With a quiet sense of satisfaction, Helen picked up the phone and dialed Janet's number. It rang only once before her lawyer's steady voice answered. Janet Turner. Hi, it's Helen. I've signed everything. It's done. Helen's voice was calm, but underneath it was a current of triumph. She had fought for this, for herself, and she had won. That's wonderful news, Helen, Janet said. We'll get everything filed and ensure all the legal protections are in place. I'll also take care of adding the no contest clause. That way, no one can challenge your will without forfeiting any claim. Helen smiled, the smallest, most liberating smile. Thank you. I want to make sure everything is airtight. I'm not going to let them undo this. Janet chuckled softly. I don't think they'll have a chance. You've been thorough. Your legacy is yours to define, Helen. Now it will be what you choose it to be. Helen set the phone down, the weight of her decision settling in her chest. She had always been afraid of the consequences, of what would happen if she stopped trying to please them. But now, as she looked at the papers in front of her, she knew she had done the right thing. It wasn't about the money, the property, or the inheritance. It was about reclaiming her life, about showing her family that they could not simply push her aside anymore. A thought crossed her mind, and she picked up the pen again, carefully adding one last detail to the plan. She had talked about it with Sally weeks ago, the idea of giving back, of ensuring that the things she held dear didn't fall into the wrong hands. Her family heirlooms, treasures passed down for generations, would no longer be locked away in a house that had no love for them. They would go to people who would cherish them, to a local charity that would preserve their history, who would understand their worth. Then, with a sudden clarity, she wrote another line, a scholarship in Robert's name, a way to ensure that his memory lived on, not through her son's neglectful eyes, but through a cause that would carry his legacy of kindness, of giving to those who truly deserved it. Daniel and Tina would not be mentioned. They would not be part of this memorial. Helen leaned back in her chair, her hands resting on the stack of papers in front of her, feeling a deep sense of relief. She had been living in the shadow of what other people thought she should be for so long. But now she was finally in control of her own story, her own legacy. As she stood and walked over to the desk, where the legal files were neatly stacked, she felt the weight in her chest lighten. For the first time in years, Helen felt the freedom of owning her choices, her future, and her past. She had faced the hardest decision of her life, and had come out on top. She placed the files in an envelope and sealed it with a sense of finality. This was it. There was no going back. She wasn't just securing her legacy, she was securing her peace. The phone rang again, an all too familiar ring that now felt like an intrusion on the calm Helen had spent so much time cultivating. She glanced at the screen. Daniel. Her finger hovered over the call button, and for a moment, she considered not answering. But she had made it this far, and if he truly wanted to make amends, he had to hear her response. She inhaled deeply before swiping to accept the call. "Hello?" she said, her voice neutral, without the anger that had once threatened to bubble to the surface. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice warm, perhaps too warm, as if he were testing the waters. "I know things have been difficult, but I've been thinking a lot about everything. I wanted to invite you to dinner. You know, Christmas dinner. It's not the same without you, and I think we should try to make it right. I really want you to join us." Helen paused, the words sinking in slowly. He wanted her there. It was supposed to be a gesture of reconciliation, a show of goodwill. A normal family thing, right? Yet, the invitation felt hollow to her, like a tired script written by someone who had no idea what it meant to truly make amends. She had spent years accommodating, bending over backward to be part of their world. The thought of doing it again, even for one more holiday, made her chest tighten with something between sorrow and relief. She took another breath, steadying herself. "Thank you for the offer, Daniel," she said, her tone calm, almost detached. "But I've already made plans. I'm not going to join you this year." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a space that Daniel used to fill with his usual pleasantries, his soft, evasive tones. But now, nothing came. The silence settled like a heavy weight between them. "You're sure?" he asked, the uncertainty clear in his voice. "I mean, we can do this. We can try again, Mom. Just this once. Please." Helen could almost see him on the other side of the phone, his face a mix of guilt and desperation. The years of strained attempts to make everything okay had been replaced with this hollow desperation to repair what could never be fixed with one dinner. She didn't need him to try again. She didn't need to be a placeholder in their world, not when she had already begun to redefine her place in it. "I'm sure," she said softly, but firmly. "I've got other plans." She ended the call before he could say anything more, her finger tapping the screen with an uncharacteristic finality. She wasn't going to argue. She wasn't going to explain why. Some things didn't need to be said anymore. For the next few minutes, Helen stood by the kitchen counter, looking out the window, her heart beating calmly in her chest. The Christmas lights in the neighborhood flickered like stars, their soft glow a stark contrast to the rest of the world's frenzy. She hadn't expected this calm. Not after everything. But here it was. The quiet. The space she had fought for. She set her phone down and turned to the task at hand. Her kitchen smelled of fresh rosemary and garlic, a comfort she had created for herself over the years. The dinner she had planned for one was more than just a meal. It was an act of reclaiming control over her life, a life that had once been dictated by others, but now felt entirely her own. She moved with a calm that surprised her, laying out the ingredients for the roast she had prepared. There was no rush, no sense of obligation. The vegetables were chopped carefully, the meat seasoned just so, as if she had all the time in the world. There was something deeply satisfying about this, about taking the time to enjoy her own company, to savor the fruits of her labor in a way that had never been possible before. Helen set the table for one. The soft glow of the candlelight flickered against the quiet walls, the hum of the oven working its quiet magic in the background. There was no noise, no chaos of children running around or the clink of silverware at a crowded table. There was just her, alone, but not lonely. She sat down at the table, her fork in hand, and took the first bite. The flavors were comforting, rich, and full. And for the first time in a long while, she realized just how much she had missed this, the stillness, the peace. She had spent so many years chasing after a family that couldn't, or wouldn't, see her. Now she had found something deeper, something truer in the solitude she had chosen. Meanwhile, across town, Tina's social media was flooded with posts. A perfectly arranged table, sparkling with festive decor, family portraits, smiling faces, carefully staged photos of the perfect Christmas. The usual. Helen noticed it, but it didn't matter. It didn't sting like it used to. The photos were a facade, an illusion of happiness. Helen didn't need their version of perfection. She had her own. As she picked up her glass of wine, she thought of the years she had spent waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to make her feel like she belonged. But now she understood that belonging didn't come from the approval of others. It came from within. Helen's gaze shifted to the window. The world outside continued to spin, but she had stopped trying to keep up with its frantic pace. She was content. No, more than that. She was at peace. As she finished her meal, the quiet of the evening wrapping around her like a soft blanket, Helen realized something profound. She didn't need their validation anymore. She had everything she needed, right here, in her own home, in her own life. And that, she thought with a small smile, was enough. No longer bound by the need to belong, Helen had found her place. Not in the world they had made for her, but in the one she had created for herself. The sound of Helen's phone buzzing broke the silence that had settled like a comforting blanket over her home. She glanced at the screen, expecting a message from Sally or maybe another notification about her favorite charity's latest campaign. But instead, it was Tina. Of course, Tina's latest post was impossible to ignore. A carefully curated family photo, the picture-perfect kind that made every moment feel like a magazine cover. There they were, Daniel, Tina, and Jake, posed around a dinner table so beautifully set it looked like an ad for a luxury brand. The table gleamed, the centerpiece arranged in carefully balanced symmetry. The smiles seemed forced, the arms too stiff. But in their eyes, there was a gleam of satisfaction, one that, for so many years, Helen had tried so hard to be a part of. Tina's caption, "Grateful for family this holiday season." Helen's stomach churned, her heart twisting. Grateful for family? For the family that had frozen her out? The words felt like a slap, even from behind a screen. For a moment, Helen just stared at the photo. She could almost hear the laughter, the fake cheerfulness that had taunted her when she stood alone on that porch, waiting for an invitation that would never come. The sharp, clear divide between the people who claimed to be her family and the reality of her own exclusion. Helen felt a heat rise in her chest, but she quickly dismissed it. She wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way she used to be. She was done letting them control her emotions, done with being manipulated by their false pretenses. Without a second thought, she printed the photo from her phone. The clink of the printer echoed through the room as the image slid from the tray, a piece of paper that seemed to embody everything she'd endured, everything she'd left behind. She walked to her journal, the leather-bound pages waiting for her thoughts, her truths, her revelations. As the printed photo lay on the desk before her, she sat down, her pen poised above the empty page. Grateful for what? She wrote, the ink flowing steadily across the paper. A family that froze me out? She paused, her heart thudding, as the words solidified the reality of her situation. She had been sidelined, her love and sacrifices ignored. All for what? A smile for the camera, a carefully constructed image of family that could never be the truth. She sighed, setting the pen down, staring at the page for a moment. This wasn't the woman she was anymore, the woman who swallowed her pain and kept pretending everything was fine. No, she was someone else now, someone who would speak her truth, even if it meant tearing apart their false world. In the weeks following the holidays, as she continued to reflect and heal, Helen found herself yearning for something more. She had been silenced for too long, swallowed up by the lies her family told. She wanted to do something that felt like a real stand, a way to reclaim her voice. That's when the idea hit her. With a determined set to her jaw, she created a blog. It was simple, unassuming in its design, but its name, Breaking the Silence, was a declaration in itself. The first post was short, a recounting of Thanksgiving, of the cold exclusion she had endured. She wrote about the pain, yes, but also about the strength it had taken to walk away, to stop being a silent victim. Her words were honest, raw, unfiltered. She wrote with the kind of truth she had always kept hidden, now uncaged. The blog felt like an exhale, the kind of release that had been long overdue. She clicked publish and leaned back in her chair, her fingers trembling slightly as she watched the post appear on the screen. She didn't know what would come next, if anyone would read it, if anyone would care, but she had to put it out there. She had to let the world see what her family had done. She had to be heard. The next few days passed in quiet solitude, but the blog began to gather traction. The first few comments were filled with support. Strangers sharing their own stories of estrangement, of family rejection. The solidarity she found in the words of others stunned her. She wasn't alone. She had thought, perhaps, that her story was unique, that no one else would understand her pain. But here, in the comments section, she found herself surrounded by voices who had lived through the same kind of heartbreak. Then, one morning, the blog reached Tina. The message came through late in the afternoon, her phone vibrating on the table. It was a direct message, Tina's name flashing on the screen. Helen's pulse quickened as she opened it, her eyes scanning the terse, venomous words that followed. Take that post down. It's not only disrespectful, it's false. You've got no right to air our dirty laundry in public. Helen felt a mix of exhaustion and liberation wash over her. Of course Tina would find it. Of course, she would try to control the narrative again, to manipulate Helen into silence. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Tina demanded the post be taken down, but Helen had already made up her mind. This time, she wouldn't back down. She tapped out her response, each word as firm as the last. No, I will not take it down. This is my truth, Tina. You don't get to rewrite it. Helen hit send, and for the first time in years, she didn't second-guess herself. The message felt like a victory, a small but vital reclaiming of her own power. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. The silence stretched afterward, but it wasn't the crushing silence of the past. It was different now. Helen was no longer afraid of her family's judgment, their attempts to control her. She had exposed the truth, her truth, and nothing, not even Tina's anger, could take that away. Helen closed her laptop, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Helen's phone buzzed again, but this time, it wasn't Tina. The message was from a local journalist who had come across Helen's blog and wanted to know more. Breaking the silence had gained traction in the past few weeks, spreading through social media like wildfire. Strangers reached out with stories that mirrored her own: family members who had pushed them away, loved ones who had chosen to forget. It seemed like there were more people than she had ever imagined who had walked down this same painful path. At first, Helen had felt reluctant to talk to anyone. She didn't want to keep reliving the hurt. But as the messages piled up, stories of pain, of estrangement, of families that had destroyed their own foundations, Helen knew that sharing her truth had started something bigger. She wasn't alone, and the courage of others gave her the strength to keep going. The journalist had asked for an interview. The local paper was interested in publishing her story. She hesitated only for a moment. In the past, the thought of exposing her personal life would have been terrifying, but now, it felt like the next step. Another way to reclaim her power. She had already laid bare the truth in her blog. Now, it was time to do it in the public eye. No more hiding. No more silence. Helen agreed to the interview. The day of the interview, she dressed in a simple navy blouse, something that made her feel calm and confident. Her reflection in the mirror was not one she recognized at first, but the longer she looked at herself, the more she understood. The woman looking back at her was someone who had been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. She had fought for her voice, and now she was ready to speak it. The journalist, a woman in her 30s with warm eyes and a kind smile, sat up in the living room. The room, with its soft lighting and comfortable furniture, felt like the perfect backdrop for this new chapter. Helen sat across from her, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her nerves settling with each breath. She was no longer afraid of telling her story. It was hers, after all. The questions came gently, but the weight of each one landed on her, like a reminder of how far she had come. She spoke of Thanksgiving, of being left out in the cold, of the years of sacrifice, of putting everyone else's needs above her own. But she also spoke of the strength she had found in finally walking away from that toxic dynamic. She didn't flinch as she recounted the hurt, the way Tina had dismissed her, the silence from Daniel. She shared the anger, the sadness, but most of all, she shared the freedom that came with choosing to let go. The interview was cathartic. It was the first time she had told the entire story aloud, without fear, without shame. And as she spoke, she realized just how far she had come. She wasn't the woman who waited for scraps of affection anymore. She was no longer the woman who stayed silent out of fear of rocking the boat. No, she was someone different, someone stronger, someone whole. As the interview came to an end, the journalist smiled. "Your story is powerful, Helen. I think a lot of people are going to see themselves in it." Helen felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She wasn't just telling her story, she was helping others tell theirs. The next morning, the article was published. The headline was straightforward: "Local woman shares her story of estrangement and reclaiming her voice." Helen's face wasn't on the front page, but the words in the article were hers. She read it slowly, absorbing every line. She felt no shame, only the deep, resonant satisfaction of someone who had finally spoken the truth. Almost immediately, messages began flooding her inbox. Support from strangers, from those who had read her words and found their own stories mirrored in them. There were messages of empathy, of recognition, of admiration. She wasn't alone, not anymore. She had found a community of people who understood what it meant to be pushed aside, to be erased by those you loved. They had found her. But then, a new message popped up. It was from Daniel. Her heart tightened. She hadn't expected it. At least, not this soon. He had been silent for weeks, and she had thought that perhaps he would continue to ignore her, continue to live his life, without acknowledging what had happened between them. But here he was, reaching out, wanting to speak. His message was brief but loaded with emotion. Mom, I've read the article. I'm so sorry for everything. I've been a bad son. I didn't protect you from Tina. I didn't know how to fix things. Can we talk? I miss you. Please forgive me. Helen stared at the message for a long time. A lump formed in her throat. The weight of his words hit her harder than she had expected. She could feel the guilt, the hesitation in his message. But there was something else there too, a plea for forgiveness that felt more like an obligation than a heartfelt apology. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't type anything immediately. Instead, she let herself process it. She had been waiting for this moment, hoping for it, but now that it was here, she felt no rush to respond. Her feelings for Daniel, for the relationship they had, were complicated. The past could not be undone, and she had spent so many years trying to fix a bond that was built on fragile foundations. She thought of the peace she had found, the strength she had cultivated, the silence she had finally embraced. She wasn't interested in being dragged back into a toxic dynamic, one where love was conditional and respect was only given when it was convenient. She tapped out her response with a calm she hadn't thought she was capable of. I've listened to your apology, Daniel, and I hear your guilt, but I'm no longer interested in being part of a toxic dynamic. I've worked hard to find peace, and I intend to hold on to it. This is the life I've chosen, and I won't go back. Her finger hovered above the send button for just a moment longer before she clicked it. It felt like the final step in a journey that had taken years. She wasn't angry. She wasn't hurt. She simply wasn't going to let anyone, drag her back into a life where she was ignored and unappreciated. She had reclaimed her voice, and now she was holding on to it, no matter what. Helen closed the message window, leaned back in her chair, and let the stillness wash over her once more. For the first time in a long time, she felt no regret, no hesitation, just peace. Helen sat at the kitchen table, her morning coffee cooling beside her. The silence in the house was no longer a painful reminder of what she had lost. It had become a comfort, a sign of the peace she had fought so hard to find. The walls were still, the soft morning light filtering through the curtains in a gentle glow. It was the quiet she had longed for, the space she needed to rebuild. But then, as she reached for her phone, a small envelope, postmarked from her old address, caught her eye on the kitchen counter. It was a letter, handwritten in a neat, familiar script. She recognized it immediately. It was from Jake. Her heart skipped a beat. Jake had been on her mind more than she cared to admit, especially after the holidays. His absence from her life, his confusion about where he belonged, had left an ache in her chest. He had always been the bright spot in the chaos, the one who understood her more than anyone else in the family. But the silence between them had grown too long, pushed away by Tina's control, by Daniel's inaction. She slowly opened the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside, the words spilled out onto the page, honest and raw. Dear Grandma Helen, I'm so sorry. I didn't want to hurt you. Mom and Dad, they've done things that aren't right. I don't know how to fix it, but I know it wasn't your fault. I want you to know that I think about you every day. I miss you and love you so much. I hope you're okay. Jake. Helen read the letter again, her eyes filling with tears. There was so much packed into those few lines: the apology, the guilt, and the understanding. He knew. He knew the truth of what had happened, and yet, he still loved her. He still saw her for who she was. She felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized until this moment how much she had missed him, how much his absence had cut through her. Jake, even as a child, had always been the one to see past the surface. He understood her heart. And now, in this small gesture, he had given her a gift: his understanding, his acknowledgement of what had happened. She took a deep breath, wiping away the tears that had gathered in her eyes. She picked up her pen and, without hesitation, began to write. Dear Jake, I've read your letter over and over. I'm so proud of you for writing to me. It shows the strength in your heart that I've always known was there. I'm sorry you've had to see things you shouldn't have, but know this: you are loved, always and forever. Nothing will change that. You don't have to fix anything. Just be yourself. Keep being the wonderful person you are. And remember, no matter where life takes you, I'm always here. With all my love, Grandma Helen. As she finished the letter, a deep sense of peace settled over her. She had done her part in the family. She had loved unconditionally, given everything she could. But now, with Jake's letter, she realized something important. It wasn't about fixing the broken pieces of a family that didn't value her. It was about holding on to the love that still existed. Jake had reached out, and that was enough. He was enough. As she sealed the letter, the quiet of the morning was interrupted by the buzz of her phone. Daniel. She hadn't heard from him in weeks since the article was published. She stared at the screen for a moment before answering. Hello? His voice came through, hesitant, almost unsure. Mom, I've been thinking a lot about everything. I've been unhappy for years, trapped in a marriage to Tina. I didn't know how to fix it, how to make things better. But I've realized I've been neglecting you too. I'm sorry for everything. I don't know how to move forward, but I want to try. Helen sat in silence, her heart aching for him in a way she hadn't expected. It was the admission she had longed to hear, but it came too late. His pain, his regret, it didn't change the years of neglect, the years of silence. She had spent so long waiting for him to see her, for him to stand up for her, but he hadn't. Daniel, she said softly, her voice steady. I hear you, and I'm sorry that you've felt trapped. But I can't fix this anymore. I've done the work to heal, to move forward. I've created a life for myself, and I'm finally at peace. I can't go back into that toxic dynamic. You need to figure things out for yourself. But know this: I will always love you. You are my son, and that will never change. But I'm no longer willing to sacrifice my well-being for a family that refuses to see me. There was silence on the other end of the phone, but it wasn't oppressive. It was simply the space they both needed. Daniel didn't say anything more, and Helen didn't push. She didn't need to. She ended the call, setting the phone down on the table with a sense of finality. The house was quiet again, but it was different this time. There were no lingering regrets, no gnawing sense of what-ifs, just a calm that came from knowing she had made the right choice. She had chosen herself. But as the quiet settled back in, a new message popped up on her screen. Tina. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but the message was brief. I want you to fix things with the family. Helen, this has gone on long enough. Helen stared at the words, the demand, the control. She took a deep breath and, without hesitation, typed her response. No, I've made my decision. I'm not fixing anything. I'm choosing my peace. She sent it, her heart steady, her resolve unwavering. There was no more room in her life for demands, for manipulation. She had made her peace, and she would hold on to it, no matter what. And as the day drifted on, Helen realized that, for the first time in her life, silence wasn't something to fear. It was something she had earned, and she cherished it. Helen sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers before her, the ink still fresh on the page. The obituary was simple, unadorned, but it carried weight, a reflection of her journey. She had spent decades allowing others to define her worth, constantly fighting for a seat at a table that never truly saw her. Now, she was writing her own final words, words that would reflect who she had become, not who they wanted her to be. She paused, looking at the names she had carefully written down. Sally Mitchell, Olivia Turner, Jake, always and forever. These were the people who had truly shown up for her, who had never turned their backs, who had never once let her feel invisible. These were the ones who had taught her what real family meant. The sound of her pen scraping across the paper seemed louder than it was, marking each stroke with finality. Helen Miller, beloved friend and mother, cherished by those who knew her worth. She had already decided she wouldn't include Daniel or Tina. They had never earned a place in this legacy, not after everything they had taken from her. They had only ever demanded, never given. She had no room for them now. Her hand shook slightly as she signed her name, but it wasn't fear that made her tremble. It was the weight of releasing the past, of letting go of what she had tried to hold together for so long. She didn't need their approval anymore. She had built something else, something stronger. Helen closed the document with a sense of finality. She had taken control of her own narrative, and with that, a new chapter began. The next step in her journey was something she had been planning for weeks. The idea had come to her while she sat with Sally one afternoon, discussing what could be done to help others who were also caught in the pain of family estrangement. Helen's own story had sparked a fire in her to help those who had nowhere else to turn, who felt as alone as she once had. She established a charity, Second Chances for Estranged Grandparents, a place where grandparents who had been cast aside could find support, resources, and, most importantly, each other. It was her way of turning her pain into something that could help others. Helen knew firsthand how lonely the journey could be, and she was determined to ensure no one else would have to face it alone. Once the charity was set up, Helen decided it was time to make another change. The house she had lived in for years was full of memories, but not the kind that made her feel at home anymore. It was time to let go of the past, of the house where the air had once been thick with unspoken words. She found a small, sunny apartment in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. It wasn't large, but it was hers. Completely, entirely hers. She decorated it with pieces that made her smile, little touches of comfort, and mementos from the friends who had shown her true loyalty. It felt like a fresh start, a clean slate. There was no clutter of old baggage here, no remnants of a life that had been forced upon her. Thanksgiving came, and Helen was no longer spending it with a family who had never truly appreciated her. Instead, she was at Sally's house, surrounded by a small group of friends who had become her new family. They laughed, shared stories, and enjoyed a meal that wasn't just about the food. It was about the people, about the warmth they had all given each other over the years. Helen sat back in her chair, looking around the table, feeling a sense of contentment she had never experienced before. There was no pretense, no fakeness. There was only love, raw and real, and she had found it in the most unlikely of places. As Christmas neared, a message from Jake popped up on her phone. It wasn't a text, but a picture, a photo of him and his new foster family. His bright smile was unmistakable, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Helen's heart swelled with pride. He was okay, more than okay. He was thriving, surrounded by people who cared for him, who gave him the love he had been denied for too long. She texted him back, a simple message of love. "I'm so proud of you, Jake. I know you've been through so much, but you are strong, and I'm always here for you. Always." That Christmas, Jake spent the day with his new foster family, but he called her later that evening. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, but it was more than just a conversation. It was a bond that had never broken, no matter the distance, no matter the silence. That was when Helen realized something profound. She didn't need her old family to be fulfilled. She had spent so long trying to fit herself into a mold that wasn't hers, trying to make something work that never would. Now, she had her own chosen family, one built on trust, understanding, and unconditional love. She didn't need to fix things with Daniel or Tina. She had fixed herself. She had found peace in a life that was hers to define. And in that peace, she had found something even more valuable than blood. A family built not on obligation, but on love. And that, Helen realized, was enough. As the days went on, she continued to embrace this new life. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to explain herself to anyone. She had done the work. She had faced the silence, and she had come out on the other side, stronger, braver, and more at peace than she ever could have imagined. No longer bound by the expectations of others, Helen had finally found her place, one that was entirely her own. Helen sat across from Janet in the sleek office, the polished wood of the desk reflecting the light that streamed through the tall windows. It was a place of business, but today, it felt different. More personal, more real. This was the final step in the process of reclaiming what was rightfully hers. She had already signed the documents that severed the old ties, but now she was finalizing the details of her legacy, her true legacy. Janet shuffled through the papers in front of her, tapping the stack lightly. "Everything's in order, Helen. The trust is set up. The no contest clause is airtight. You've done the hard work. All that's left is to sign and send it off." Helen glanced down at the document, the familiar words that had become her reality in recent months. Her assets, her property, her investments were all being allocated to those who had stood by her, those who had valued her beyond her role as a mother or grandmother. It was a release, a freedom that came not just from the wealth, but from the finality of it all. She was no longer bound to the expectations and manipulations of a family that had never truly seen her. The pen felt heavy in her hand, but she signed without hesitation. "It's done," she said, her voice steady. She had made her choice. It had been months since the final rift with Daniel and Tina, but now, there was no more ambiguity. The ties had been cut. Her future was now her own to shape. Janet placed the documents in an envelope and smiled warmly at Helen. "You've done something many people would never have the strength to do. You've taken control of your life, and that's something worth celebrating." Helen felt a warmth spread through her chest at the words. It wasn't just about the money or the inheritance. It was about choosing to live a life that reflected who she truly was, not the person others had tried to make her into. She had fought for her voice and reclaimed it, piece by piece. This was the final act of self-love. As she left Janet's office, a sense of peace settled over her, but the world wasn't finished with her yet. A few days later, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. "Helen?" Daniel's voice came through, tentative. "I've read the article. I don't know what to say. I should have protected you. I've failed you as a son. I know it's too late, but I want to make things right." Please, can we start over? Helen closed her eyes as she listened. She had expected this moment, but now that it had come, she was struck by the weight of his words. The guilt in his voice was unmistakable, but so was the realization that it was too little, too late. His apology didn't undo the years of neglect, the years of silence, the years of waiting for him to choose her, when all along, she had been the one doing all the choosing. You've been unhappy for years, Daniel, Helen said quietly, her voice firm. I hear your apology, but trust is something that can't be rebuilt overnight. You've had your chances, and now, I've chosen my peace. I won't go back into that dynamic. I won't sacrifice my well-being for a family that's never truly valued me. There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Daniel spoke, his voice barely audible. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Helen held the phone for a moment longer, but she didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The weight of the words had been said, but there was no turning back now. She had moved on. And as much as she still loved Daniel, she knew that love was no longer enough to bridge the gap between them. She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair. It was over, truly over. But in some strange way, it felt like the beginning. A new chapter. A few days later, the phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from a local publisher. The memoir that Helen had written, inspired by her blog, had been accepted for publication. It was surreal, almost too much to comprehend. Her story, the story of estranged grandparents finding their voice, was about to reach the world. She read the email again, the words sinking in. The idea of telling her story on such a grand scale was daunting, but it was also empowering. She had always feared sharing her truth, but now she was ready. Her journey could help others. She would speak for those who felt as lost as she had once felt, and she would ensure that their stories, those of love, loss, and recovery, were heard. As the book began to take shape, Tina's attempts to repair her public image grew more aggressive. She had hired a public relations firm, trying to spin the narrative, trying to paint herself as the victim in all of this. It was painful to watch, but Helen wasn't fooled. The community saw through Tina's facade. They knew the truth, Helen's truth. And the support for Helen continued to grow, even as Tina's attempts to re-enter the spotlight faltered. It was then that Helen realized something profound. Tina's campaign was nothing more than a desperate attempt to reclaim control over a narrative that was no longer hers. She had never understood the power of silence, the power of standing firm in your truth. But Helen did. And she wasn't about to let anyone, not even Tina, rewrite the ending of her story. With her memoir set to be published and her charity gaining traction, Helen's voice grew louder. She became an advocate for estranged grandparents, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. Her platform reached beyond just a few, and as her voice resonated with more and more people, she realized that the silence she had cherished had become the foundation for something far more powerful. Her legacy was no longer just about the money she had left behind. It was about the love she had found, the peace she had fought for, and the lives she had touched by telling her truth. And that, Helen realized, was the legacy they had lost, the legacy she had gained. The knock at the door came just as Helen was settling into her armchair, the light from the fire casting long shadows across the room. She looked up, startled. No one ever came to her new apartment unannounced, especially not at this hour. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend she hadn't heard. But then, just as quickly, she recognized the weight of the moment. This was it. The moment she had known would come eventually. She rose slowly from her chair, her hands steady despite the knot of anticipation forming in her chest. When she opened the door, there stood James, her son, Daniel's father, his face pale and drawn, his eyes clouded with regret. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them stretched longer than it had any right to. James, with his worn features and weary eyes, looked like a man who had spent too long avoiding the truth. I, I've been thinking about everything, James finally said, his voice thick. The things I've let slide, the things I've ignored. I see now how much damage my silence has done, and I've realized that I've failed you, failed both of us. Helen stood there motionless, her gaze steady as she met his eyes. His words, heavy with remorse, didn't have the weight she expected them to. She had been waiting for this moment for a long time, the apology she'd craved for years. But now that it was here, it felt strangely distant, like a conversation she'd already had with herself in the quiet moments of her own mind. I want to make things right, Margaret, James continued, stepping forward, his voice softening. I know it's too late, but I want to rebuild our relationship. I want to try. Please, can you forgive me? Helen's heart ached at his words, but she didn't let herself soften. The apology wasn't the balm she had once thought it would be. She had spent so long seeking closure from him, but now she realized it wasn't his forgiveness she needed. It was her own. I'm not sure if forgiveness is the right word for this, she said, her voice calm but unwavering. You've been silent for so long, James. You've allowed this family to fracture beyond repair, and you never stood up for me. I don't know if forgiveness is something that can just be given away. I can't just forget all that's been lost. She paused, her words sharp as they hit the space between them. If you truly want to make things right, it's not me who needs to forgive you. You need to take responsibility for the actions that have brought us here. You need to take responsibility for your silence, for letting Tina control everything while I was left to pick up the pieces. James shifted, his eyes filling with emotion, but Helen could see it in his face. He wasn't ready to take responsibility, not fully. He was still trying to rewrite his role in this story, trying to claim redemption without fully understanding the cost. Helen's gaze hardened, her voice steady and resolute. But I'm not waiting for you to fix this anymore. I've spent years waiting. I've given everything I had, and it still wasn't enough. I've built my life again, and I've learned that I don't need you, or anyone, to validate my worth anymore. I've moved on. I'm not going back to the way things were. James's shoulders slumped as if the weight of her words had physically struck him. He opened his mouth. But no words came. For a moment he looked like a man on the verge of something, perhaps understanding, perhaps regret. But it was too late. Helen felt a strange sense of release as she watched him stand there, silent, his head bowed. He wasn't ready for what she needed him to be. She had hoped, once, for this to be different. But now, the truth was clear. Some things couldn't be repaired. Not by words. Not by promises. I think it's time for you to go, James, she said, her voice soft but firm. The past can't be undone. I'm done waiting for the family I thought I deserved. I've created my own family now. And you, well, you need to figure out who you are without me. The room felt cold in that moment, the fire crackling quietly in the background. James didn't argue. He nodded slowly, his shoulders heavier now than they had been when he arrived. He took a step back, his hand hovering for a moment, as if he wanted to say something more, but there was nothing left to say. I'm sorry, he whispered, before turning and walking away. Helen didn't watch him leave. She turned her back to him, returning to the chair by the window, the soft glow of the fire now the only warmth in the room. She felt no relief, no bitterness, just an overwhelming sense of closure. Finally, the door clicked shut behind him, and the silence returned. She was free, and yet, for the first time, it didn't feel like an end. It was simply the next step in the life she had chosen for herself, The past was no longer hers to carry, and that weight was lifted, finally, from her shoulders. And for the first time in years, Margaret didn't feel the need to look back. There was nothing left for her there. Only the future. A future that, for the first time, felt entirely hers. She leaned back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. The quiet was hers now, and it was all she needed. Helen sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the morning filling the air as she slowly rewrote the obituary. This time, she had control over the words, over the legacy she wanted to leave behind. The process had always been something she dreaded in the past, something cold and distant, a ritual she had never wanted to face. But today, as her pen moved steadily across the paper, it felt different. This was her legacy, and for the first time in her life, it would reflect the truth of who she was, not who others wanted her to be. The words flowed easily, no longer bound by the obligations she had once carried. Helen Miller, beloved friend, sister, and mother, cherished by those who truly knew her worth. She paused, letting the finality of the sentence settle in. There was no room for Daniel and Tina here. The space had been carved out for the people who had loved her without condition, the ones who had stood by her when she needed it the most. They were the ones who deserved to be named. Sally Mitchell, Olivia Turner, Jake. The names were small but powerful, a representation of a life built on respect and mutual love. A family that was more than blood. A family by choice. With a deep breath, Helen closed the notebook and leaned back in her chair. She didn't need to include the things she had lost. The family she had once longed to fix was gone. And the void they had left had been filled by those who truly mattered. And she was at peace with that. A few weeks later, Helen stood in front of her new apartment, a small, cozy space in a sunny building tucked on the outskirts of town. She had downsized, leaving behind the house that had once been a home, but had long since become a symbol of all that had been broken. The empty rooms, filled with painful memories of dinners never shared and promises left unfulfilled, no longer had a place in her life. As she locked the door behind her for the last time, a sense of freedom washed over her. This apartment, simple and modest, was hers. Completely hers. No more living under the shadow of expectations, no more holding on to a past that had never served her well. Here, she could finally breathe. She stepped into the sunlight, the warmth of the day wrapping around her like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. A week later, Helen sat down at her writing desk, a piece of stationery in front of her. She had promised Olivia a letter, a small token of her pride and love. Olivia had been a light in Helen's life, and watching her grow into the woman she had become filled Helen with joy. The strength she had found in herself had been mirrored in Olivia's resilience, and Helen had to let her know how proud she was. Dear Olivia, I have watched you grow with so much admiration. You are stronger, braver, and more capable than I ever was at your age. I see the woman you're becoming, and it fills me with pride. You've found your own voice, your own strength, and I believe in you with all my heart. Keep going, keep pushing forward, and never forget that you are loved. With all my love, Grandma Helen. She placed the pen down gently, her heart lighter as she folded the letter. She didn't need grand gestures. She didn't need to over-explain. This letter was enough. It said everything she had wanted to say for years but never found the courage to. The local support group for estranged families was meeting that evening. Helen had agreed to speak, sharing her story with others who had walked a similar path. When she arrived, the room was filled with hesitant faces, people who wore their pain like a second skin. Some of them had lost children, others had lost parents. But as she spoke about her own experience, about the Thanksgiving she had spent alone, about the decision to finally walk away from a toxic dynamic, she saw the eyes of the group soften. Her story was their story, and in sharing it, she gave them permission to do the same. Afterward, as people gathered to speak one-on-one, a woman approached Helen. She was middle-aged, her face lined with years of worry and pain. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper. "But your story, it hit me hard. I I haven't been able to speak to my daughter in over a year. She cut me out of her life. And hearing you, I thought maybe I wasn't alone." Helen looked at the woman, her heart aching. "You're not alone," she said softly. "It's not easy, but you're stronger than you think. You have to keep your peace, no matter how hard it gets." Tears welled in the woman's eyes, and Helen could feel her own heart breaking for her. This was the pain she had known, the same ache that had gnawed at her for so long. But now, it was different. It was shared. Together, they had found their voices. The woman took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she held out a piece of paper. I wanted to thank you for showing me that I'm not invisible. Maybe I can't fix things with her, but I can still find peace." Helen took the paper, her hand steady, and held the woman's gaze. "You're not invisible," she said, "and neither am I, and we won't be silenced anymore." As the group continued to talk, Helen stood at the edge of the room, watching the small group of estranged families finding their strength in each other. The support group wasn't just a place for pain, it was a place for hope. And in that moment, Helen realized that the family she had once wanted had been lost. Yes, but in its place, she had found something even stronger. A family of her choosing. People who understood, who could see her for who she was, and who loved her without conditions. And that was more than enough. Her legacy, the one she had carefully written for herself, was no longer about what she had lost. It was about what she had gained: the love, the peace, and the strength to move forward, one step at a time. The air was crisp, the sun low in the sky as Helen pulled into the parking lot of the cancer center. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She hadn't been back here since her initial donation, but today, it felt different. Today, her name was on the plaque, a small but permanent mark of the impact she had made in a world that had never truly appreciated her. She stood in front of the glass doors looking at the sign, Helen Miller Foundation for Cancer Research. She felt a swell of pride as she read the words, her own legacy written in bold letters. This was hers, a project born out of her generosity, her pain, and her desire to make something meaningful out of everything she had lost. The doors opened and she stepped inside, the familiar hum of the building greeting her. She was led to a quiet corner of the center where the plaque had been placed. There it was, mounted on the wall, her name immortalized in the work she had done to help others. She ran her fingers lightly over the cool metal, the smooth surface of the letters familiar and comforting. Helen smiled softly. This was the light she had never received from her family. This was the validation, the acknowledgement that had always been so painfully absent from her life. It wasn't the kind of recognition she had wanted, but it was the one that mattered. The plaque, the donation, the work. It was hers. All of it. Her decision. She had created this. In the corner of her mind, she knew this wasn't the end. This was just a marker along the path she had walked to get here. A path of healing, not just for herself, but for others. She turned and walked away from the plaque, her footsteps light as she made her way through the center. Later that afternoon, back at her apartment, Helen received a text from Olivia. "Grandma, I'm so proud to share my art portfolio with you. Can we talk later?" Helen's heart lifted. Olivia had always been a source of joy in her life. She was the bright thread that had stitched itself through the grayness of her years of isolation. She had watched her granddaughter grow into someone strong, capable, and unapologetically herself. Helen opened the attachment, and there, before her, was a stunning array of Olivia's artwork. Portraits, landscapes, abstracts, each piece infused with the depth of her emotions, her experiences. It was clear from the work that Olivia had poured herself into her art, just as Helen had poured herself into her legacy. As Helen scrolled through the images, her heart swelled. This, she thought, is what I leave behind. Not them. She placed the phone down gently, her mind racing with pride for the young woman Olivia had become. She had given her so much, and in return, Olivia was finding her own way, her own light. This was the legacy that mattered, the kind of love that shaped and sustained, not the kind that broke or abandoned. Helen walked to her desk where she kept her journal, the one that had held her thoughts and reflections for so many years. She picked up the pen, the familiar motion of writing a comfort. You are what I leave behind, Olivia. Not them. Not the ones who couldn't see me. But you. Your strength. Your resilience. Your love. That's my legacy. Her words flowed easily, an affirmation of everything she had fought for. She wasn't just writing for Olivia. She was writing for herself too. She had reclaimed her life, her story, and now she was watching it unfold in ways she had never imagined. Later that day, the doorbell rang, and Helen opened it to find Diana, her lawyer, standing on her doorstep. In her hands was the final set of documents, documents that would close the last chapter of Helen's legal battles, the will, the trust, the foundations she had set up for Jake and her chosen family. They were all sealed now. Diana handed over the papers, smiling warmly. It's all in order, Helen. Your legacy is officially set. You've made something beautiful. Helen felt a strange sense of relief, a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying slipping away. For so long, she had been waiting for someone to tell her that it was okay, that she had done enough. But now, as she signed the final document, she realized something crucial. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore. She had created this life on her own terms. This was hers, all hers. I'll toast to this, Helen said, offering Diana a glass of wine as they sat down at the kitchen table, the papers spread between them. Diana raised her glass. To you, Helen. To the future. Helen's gaze softened as she looked out the window, the setting sun casting its golden light over the city. She could feel the peace that had eluded her for so long settling in, not as an absence, but as something full and complete. She didn't need to be validated by Daniel, Tina, or anyone else. The toxic dynamics, the years of trying to fit into a mold that wasn't hers, they were all behind her now. She had built a new life, one she could be proud of, one that was shaped by her own hands, her own decisions. And for the first time, Helen realized that she was no longer bound by the chains of family drama. She had created a life on her own terms, and in doing so, she had found the freedom she had always craved. As the evening stretched on, and she looked at the people who had stood by her side, Sally, Olivia, Jake, even the woman from the support group who had reached out to her, Helen knew that she had built something stronger than blood. She had created a family of her own choosing, one built on trust, love, and respect. And in that, she had found everything she had ever needed. Finally, as she sat in the quiet of her apartment, her journal beside her, Helen allowed herself a long, deep breath. The silence wasn't an absence anymore. It was a reflection of the peace she had found. The light they never gave her, she had built for herself. And it was enough. The air was warm as Helen stood among the sea of parents and students at Olivia's college orientation, the campus bustling with excitement and nervous energy. She watched her granddaughter from a distance, standing tall among the other students, her shoulders square with confidence. The years of watching Olivia grow had been filled with moments of pride, but this one was different. This was a new chapter, a beginning, and Helen couldn't help but feel like she had witnessed something extraordinary in the young woman before her. She turned to Sally, who stood beside her, a smile on her face, just as proud. "Look at her," Helen whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "She's stronger than I ever was at her age." Sally nodded, her eyes soft with warmth. "She's your legacy, Helen, and it's one you can be proud of." Helen didn't need to say anything in response. Her heart was full, the pride she felt almost palpable, spreading out through her chest in waves. For so long she had wondered what she would leave behind, what her legacy would be after the pain of estrangement had burned away the bonds of blood. And now, standing here with Sally, watching Olivia walk toward her future, she knew the answer. The life she had chosen, the family she had made, was everything. As the speaker at the orientation took the stage, he began to speak about family, about support, about love. Helen couldn't help but listen as he quoted something she had written in her blog not too long ago. "Sometimes your bloodline ends with betrayal, but your legacy begins with love." The words felt like a kiss on the cheek from fate itself, a reminder that the life she had chosen was the one she had built from her heart, one that was built on love, not obligation. She watched as Olivia turned to wave at her, a broad smile across her face, and Helen's heart swelled. She wasn't alone. She never had to be again. The past was gone, but this was what had replaced it. This was the life she had chosen, the life that was hers to define. After the orientation, as the last of the students and parents trickled out, Helen walked back to her car with Sally. The evening sun cast long shadows, and the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the campus. The air had a crispness to it now, the promise of fall just around the corner, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Helen felt a deep sense of peace settle in her chest. When she returned to her apartment, it felt like a sanctuary. It was small, humble, but every corner was filled with purpose. Every piece of furniture, every object on the shelf was something she had chosen, something that reflected who she was now, no longer the woman who had been ignored and pushed aside, but the woman who had taken back her power. She set her keys down on the kitchen counter and, for a moment, just stood there. The silence of the apartment felt right, a soft hum in the background of her thoughts. There was no more weight from the past, no more tension. She had rebuilt everything, her life, her family, her peace. As she moved toward the living room, she saw the last folder on the table, the final legal documents, the ones that had closed the door on the old chapter of her life. She had signed the last of them just a few weeks ago, but somehow they still felt like a milestone she hadn't fully processed. It was official now. There was no turning back. Helen sat down on the couch, the folder in her lap, and took a deep breath. She poured herself a cup of tea, the warmth of the mug grounding her as she ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the paper. These were the final documents that closed her old life, the life she had been trying to hold together for so long. But in letting go, she had opened up space for something new, something of her own making. As she sat there, sipping her tea, Helen smiled. The journal she had been writing in for so many years lay open beside her. She picked it up, and as she read over her final entry, the words seemed to resonate deeper than ever before. "I survived twice." She had survived the hurt. She had survived the betrayal. And now she had emerged. Not just whole, but stronger than she had ever imagined. For the first time in a long while, Helen felt no need to hold on to the past. There was no more should have been, no more regret over the family that never truly saw her. Her life was built on her own terms now. She had chosen her path, and in doing so, she had created a future filled with hope, love, and, most importantly, peace. She placed her pen back on the table and let the stillness of the apartment wash over her once again. The world outside was quiet, but inside, Helen had found the peace she had longed for. No longer bound by the chains of family drama or obligation, she had finally freed herself. And as she closed her journal, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just about the love she had given to others. It was about the love she had chosen to give herself. In the silence, in the peace, she had found everything she needed. The last light of the evening poured through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. Helen felt it, an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life she had built, the life she had chosen. While I froze outside on Thanksgiving, my son and his kids enjoyed turkey inside, but I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the love you choose to share. And with that, Helen closed her eyes, feeling the weight of a lifetime of pain finally lift, replaced by the light she had created for herself.